For nearly 4 years, a European capital was completely cut off from the world. No running water, no electricity, dwindling food, and a sniper's bullet waiting at every street corner. How does a modern city of nearly 400,000 people survive 1.425 days of absolute isolation? Welcome to the Siege of Sarajevo, the longest blockade of a capital city in modern warfare history. To understand how this nightmare began, we have to rewind to the complex puzzle of Yugoslavia. For decades, this socialist state was held together by its strongman leader, Josip Broz Tito, blending diverse ethnic and religious groups. But when Tito died in 1980, the glue holding the nation together began to crack under the weight of rising nationalism. By the early 1990s, Yugoslavia was violently splintering apart. Slovenia and Croatia broke away first, sparking brutal conflicts. Then, in early 1992, the multi-ethnic Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina held its own referendum for independence. While Bosnian Muslims and Croats voted overwhelmingly to leave, the Bosnian Serbs boycotted the vote, demanding to stay with Serbia. Overnight, the vibrant, cosmopolitan city of Sarajevo transformed into a fractured battleground. Barricades made of overturned cars and furniture suddenly appeared across city streets, splitting neighborhoods in half. Bosnian Serb forces, backed by the heavily armed Yugoslav People's Army, mobilized quickly, seizing the high ground. Sarajevo sits in a valley, surrounded by steep mountains, a beautiful geographic feature that suddenly became a deadly tactical trap. By May 1992, over 250 tanks, 120 mortars, and countless snipers had ringed the hillsides. The siege had officially begun. Inside the city, the reality of the siege set in immediately. The transition from modern life to medieval isolation was shockingly fast. On May 2, 1992, the main post office was completely destroyed, severing telephone lines and cutting Sarajevo's voice off from the world. Pumping stations were shut down. The electrical grid was disconnected. A bustling European capital was thrown straight back into the dark ages. Imagine waking up in your apartment, looking out the window, and realizing you can never leave. Every exit is covered by sniper fire. This was not a traditional battlefield. The front lines were city blocks, parks, and apartment buildings. It was a war of living rooms and stairwells. The main boulevard, Ulica Zemaja od Bosne, quickly earned a terrifying, world-famous nickname, Sniper Alley. To cross the street just to get water or bread, civilians had to sprint for their lives behind makeshift barriers of shipping containers. High-rise buildings provided perfect nests for marksmen looking down on the valley. Stepping off the pavement became a deadly, daily lottery. But surely, the outside world wouldn't just watch this happen. Right, the United Nations stepped in, creating a peacekeeping force called UNPROFOR. However, these blue-helmeted peacekeepers were strictly neutral. They had a mandate to deliver humanitarian aid, but absolutely no authority to stop the fighting. White UN armored vehicles rolled through the burning streets, acting as heavily guarded delivery trucks rather than a protective military force. The Sarajevo airport became a crucial lifeline, handed over to the UN. It allowed transport planes to drop off basic pallets of flour and oil. Yet, moving that food from the tarmac to the starving citizens meant crossing a lethal gauntlet of constant artillery shelling. The Bosnian defenders, mostly lightly armed police and citizen volunteers wearing sneakers and jeans, held the city perimeter, preventing a total collapse. Outgunned and surrounded, the people of Sarajevo realized a harsh truth: no army was coming to save them. Survival was entirely in their own hands. With the city locked down, the basic arithmetic of daily life changed completely. Ground floor apartments and dark cellars became the only safe living spaces. Families huddled together by candlelight, burning old books, shoes, and broken furniture in makeshift stoves just to survive the freezing Bosnian winters. Water became the ultimate currency. With taps completely dry, citizens had to rely on a few surviving public breweries and natural springs. They would wait in line for hours with plastic jerry cans, knowing that any gathering of people was a prime target for mortar strikes from the hills. Food was equally scarce. A thriving, yet ruthless black market emerged where a single kilogram of coffee or sugar could cost hundreds of dollars. Imagine paying a full month's salary for a few dusty eggs. The UN humanitarian airlifts provided bare minimums, but it was never enough to feed everyone. But the siege wasn't just a physical starvation, it was a psychological one. Yet, the people of Sarajevo absolutely refused to let their culture die. Underground rock concerts, secret theater performances, and even a Miss Besieged Sarajevo beauty pageant were held in defiance of the falling shells. They bravely held up banners reading, "Don't let them kill us." It was a surreal blend of human spirit trapped inside an abnormal nightmare. By mid-1993, the situation reached a breaking point. The city urgently needed a physical lifeline to the outside world, beyond the reach of sniper fire. The only piece of free territory was a narrow strip of land just past the UN-controlled airport runway, leading to Mount Igman. So, armed with shovels, pickaxes, and absolute desperation, civilian volunteers began digging a secret underground passage right beneath the UN peacekeepers. Working 24 hours a day in grueling shifts, they clawed through the heavy clay and mud. This marvel of survival became known as the Tunnel of Hope. It was incredibly cramped, only about 1.5 meters high, often flooded with knee-deep water, and severely lacking proper ventilation. But it worked. Through this narrow muddy vein, vital weapons, electricity cables, food, and even injured civilians flowed, keeping the resilient heartbeat of Sarajevo alive. The tunnel was an absolute miracle of engineering and willpower, but a 1.5-meter dirt tube couldn't fully supply a modern city indefinitely. As 1993 bled into 1994, the siege became a grim, normalized routine. Seasons changed, but the encircling ring of artillery remained tightly locked. What made the siege of Sarajevo entirely unique in history was that this medieval-style blockade was heavily televised globally. International journalists were famously stationed at the bright yellow Holiday Inn Hotel, located directly on Sniper Alley, right in the line of fire. Every evening, families in Paris, New York, and Tokyo would sit in their cozy living rooms and watch a European capital being systematically destroyed. Yet, the international response remained painfully paralyzed. The United Nations was bogged down by complex bureaucracy, endless debates, and a fear of military escalation. Western leaders held countless diplomatic conferences, drawing so-called red lines on maps that were immediately ignored and crossed by the besieging forces. Meanwhile, the heavy artillery shells kept falling without mercy. On average, the city absorbed over 300 explosive impacts every single day. But on February 5, 1994, a single mortar shell broke the geopolitical deadlock and changed the course of the entire conflict. It struck the Markale marketplace in the center of town, a crowded area where desperate civilians were trading their last possessions for scarce food. The devastation was horrific. 68 people lost their lives in an instant, and nearly 150 were injured. It was the deadliest single attack of the siege so far. This time, the shocking aftermath was captured instantly by cameras and broadcast around the globe. The sheer brutality could no longer be swept under the rug. Facing massive public outrage, the UN and NATO finally issued a genuine military ultimatum: pull back the heavy weapons, or face immediate airstrikes. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the relentless bombardment actually paused. A fragile, tense ceasefire took hold over the exhausted city. Citizens cautiously emerged from the dark cellars, feeling the warmth of the sun on their faces without the immediate fear of a sniper's bullet. But the war wasn't over. But in a war fueled by deep ethnic resentment, ceasefires are often just a tactical pause to reload. The peace didn't last. By late 1994 and into 1995, the Bosnian Serb forces renewed their offensive, tightening the iron stranglehold on Sarajevo once again. The city's brief taste of sunlight was violently snatched away. The snipers returned to their high-rise perches, and the daily lottery of death resumed. NATO threatened more airstrikes to stop the renewed shelling, but the besieging forces executed a shocking countermove. In a brazen defiance of international law, they captured hundreds of UN peacekeepers and used them as literal human shields. Images of blue-helmeted soldiers handcuffed to radar poles and ammunition dumps were broadcast worldwide, completely humiliating the United Nations. This hostage crisis temporarily paralyzed NATO. How could they drop bombs when their own peacekeepers were tied directly to the targets? Inside Sarajevo, the psychological weight became crushing. The fading hope that the outside world would save them completely evaporated into the cold air. Winter returned, and it was the most brutal one yet. The trees in the city's parks had all been chopped down long ago for firewood. Even the glorious stadiums from the 1984 Winter Olympics were repurposed, their wooden seats burned for heat. Their training grounds turned into makeshift graveyards, with no safe space left to bury the victims. Football pitches and neighborhood gardens were filled with thousands of simple wooden markers. To avoid being targeted by sniper fire during funerals, burials had to be conducted in the dead of night, in total darkness, without lights or loud prayers. Yet, despite the unimaginable trauma and freezing temperatures, the defenders of Sarajevo never surrendered. The city simply refused to break. Deeply frustrated by the UN's embarrassing weakness, Britain and France finally decided enough was enough, forming a heavily armed rapid reaction force. Unlike the neutral peacekeepers, these elite units rolled in painted in dark camouflage, not bright white. The rules of engagement were about to change dramatically. The arrival of the Rapid Reaction Force wasn't just a symbolic gesture. They brought heavy artillery and a clear mandate to shoot back if threatened. But the final trigger came in August 1995. Tragically, another mortar shell struck the Markale marketplace, taking 43 civilian lives in broad daylight. This time, there were no endless debates or empty red lines. The international community had finally reached its absolute breaking point. On August 30th, the skies over the Balkans roared to life as NATO launched Operation Deliberate Force, a massive, coordinated air campaign. Over 400 aircraft from 15 different nations swarmed the airspace, executing the largest military action in NATO's history up to that point. Precision-guided munitions rained down on the mountains, systematically dismantling the besieging army's ammunition dumps, radar sites, and communication networks. On the tactical map, the terrifying red ring that had choked Sarajevo for over 3 years finally began to shatter into pieces. Simultaneously, the British and French Rapid Reaction Force pounded enemy artillery positions from the ground, creating a devastating crossfire. The once untouchable forces on the hillside suddenly found themselves completely outgunned, their heavy weapons turning into burning heaps of scrap metal. Down in the dark cellars of Sarajevo, civilians listened to the thunderous explosions above, realizing these bombs were actually destroying their cage. Within days, the impossible happened. The siege lines collapsed, and the Bosnian Serb command was forced to pull their remaining guns away. Water slowly began to flow through the pipes again. The electrical grid flickered back to life, bringing light to a city that had forgotten it. Combined with major ground offensives by Croatian and Bosnian forces in other regions, the military balance of power shifted completely overnight. By mid-September 1995, after weeks of relentless pressure, the artillery fire surrounding the capital finally went silent. The siege was broken. With their military leverage destroyed, the warring factions were left with no other choice but to sit down at the negotiating table. In November 1995, leaders gathered not in Europe, but at an isolated Air Force base in Dayton, Ohio, to hammer out a peace deal. The negotiations were incredibly tense, essentially locking bitter enemies in a room until they agreed to stop killing each other. Finally, on December 14th, the Dayton Agreement was formally signed in Paris, officially bringing the devastating Bosnian War to an end. The siege of Sarajevo, which had lasted an agonizing 1.425 days, was over. The longest blockade in modern history was finally broken. But the peace treaty was far from perfect. To stop the fighting, the country was divided into two highly complex, semi-autonomous regions. One half was designated for the Bosniak Croat Federation, and the other for the Bosnian Serb Republic, held together by a weak central government. This convoluted political system successfully stopped the bombs from falling, but it institutionalized the deep ethnic divisions that caused the war. Back in Sarajevo, the silence was almost as deafening as the artillery fire used to be. The immediate threat was gone, but the ruins remained. Over 10,000 people, including more than 1,500 children, had lost their lives within the city's perimeter during those nearly 4 years. The physical damage was staggering. Nearly every single building in the city had been hit, damaged, or completely destroyed by explosive shells. Priceless cultural heritage was wiped out. The National Library, containing millions of irreplaceable historic manuscripts, had been burned to the ground. The landscape of the city was permanently altered. Parks were gone, replaced by sprawling white cemeteries that climbed up the surrounding hills. Yet, the physical rebuilding began almost immediately. International aid flooded in to patch up the concrete, restore the water, and rebuild the bridges. Scaffolding covered the city as bullet holes were filled and shattered glass was swept away. The vibrant cosmopolitan spirit slowly started to awaken. However, patching concrete is much easier than healing human trauma. The invisible scars left on the survivors would take generations to fade. Today, Sarajevo is once again a bustling, vibrant European capital, nestled beautifully in its mountain valley. Tourists from all over the world walk down the very same streets once known as Sniper Alley, drinking coffee where concrete barricades used to stand. But if you look closely at the pavement as you walk, you will occasionally notice strange, irregular red patterns. These are the Sarajevo roses. They are actual mortar craters left in the concrete that have been filled with bright red resin. They mark the exact locations where explosive shells claimed human lives, serving as a permanent, silent memorial embedded right into the daily path of the citizens. As for the architects of the siege, justice was slow, but it eventually caught up with them. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, or ICTY, was established in The Hague specifically to prosecute these war crimes. After years on the run, many of the top political and military leaders responsible for the blockade were hunted down, tried, and sentenced to life in prison. It was a historic milestone, proving that modern international law could, and would, hold high-ranking leaders accountable for crimes against humanity. So, what is the ultimate lesson from these 1.425 days of darkness? The siege of Sarajevo proved how incredibly fragile modern civilization actually is, and how quickly it can be dismantled. It takes centuries to build a cosmopolitan society where different cultures live together in peace. But it only takes a spark of radical nationalism to burn it to the ground. Yet, simultaneously, it also proved the absolute, unbreakable resilience of the human spirit when faced with complete despair. The people of Sarajevo didn't just survive, they fought to retain their humanity, their art, and their dignity when the world turned its back on them. Thank you so much for watching this chapter of history with us. If you want to support more historical deep dives, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. See you next time.